All right, we are going to be looking at the Constitution and the new Republic. Really, how do we begin to frame our new government? So let's begin. So, we are going to be looking at reform, looking at our Constitution. Now, there's going to be demands for a stronger Constitution. Alexander Hamilton called for a national convention to overhaul the Articles of Confederation. Now, Hamilton is going to find an ally with James Madison, who persuaded the Virginia legislature to meet an interstate conference on commercial questions. Now, only 5 states sent delegates to the meeting in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786. However, the conference approved a proposal by Hamilton for a convention of special delegates from all states to meet in Philadelphia the following year. George Washington made plans to attend, which is going to give the conference huge popularity and credibility because George Washington is really known as the hero of the American Revolution. Now, this convention is going to be between May and September of 1787. 55 men are going to be representing all states except Rhode Island. And the average age is actually 45, so they're all extremely young. Benjamin Franklin is, to my recollection, the oldest person there. And these are the founding fathers. And they are very well educated for their time, and most were wealthy property owners. Now, Washington chose to proceed over the sessions, and it was closed to the public and the press. Each state delegation was given a single vote, and the major decisions did not require unanimity, like in Congress, but a single majority. Now, they did all agree that the United States needed a stronger central government, and so the plan that was devised was the Virginian plan, or their Virginia plan. Now, the Virginia plan was created by Madison, who was 36 years old at that time. And the plan shaped the agenda, proposing a national government that ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary branches. And that was approved. Now, the Virginia plan also proposed having a legislature made of 2 houses. And in the lower house, states would be represented in proportion to their population, while the upper house were to be elected by the lower house under no rigid system of representation. Therefore, the smaller states might at times have no members at all in the upper house because they have smaller populations than, say, Virginia or the Carolinas that have huge slave populations. And so these made some of the smaller states extremely nervous. And after the delegates from the smaller states voiced their opinion and their concerns, the supporters of the Virginia plan realized that they would have to make changes for those smaller states. And so they agreed to permit members of the upper house, the future Senate, to be elected by the legislatures. Now, there are some other questions that weren't really covered within this plan, such as slavery. How were they to be counted as part of the population, or would they be considered property? They are human beings, after all, although some people assume that they were not, because they look so drastically different from Europeans. And so how would you count them? These are a few of the questions that were raised that were not answered at this time. And so there is going to be the Great Compromise. So after debating for weeks, the convention created a grand committee chaired by Benjamin Franklin and 1 delegate from each state. And they called for a 2-house legislature. In the lower house, the states will be represented on the basis of population, and each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a free person in determining the basis for representation and direct taxation. And the upper house, the states will be represented equally with 2 members per state. And this is going to be approved on July 16th, 1787. And the convention also agreed to not interfere with slavery and to bar the new government from stopping the slave trade for 20 years, which means they can't address it until 1807. So there are some unresolved issues from this compromise. There's no definition of citizenship. It does not discuss or even talk about the status of the Native American tribes, and it does not list any individual rights. So there is still some issues that need to be addressed, but they are not addressed at this time. So next, with the creation, is we have the Constitution of 1787. Now there's really 2 questions regarding this Constitution, and that is sovereignty and limiting power. There was no sovereignty because the political power came from the people, not themselves. Presently, the power was in the hands of the states, and so the resolution of the problem of sovereignty made possible one of its distinct features: federalism, or the division of powers between the national and state governments. And the Constitution also provided a solution to the problem of concentrated authority. The best way to avoid tyranny was to keep governments close to the people, or so it was believed. And so Madison believed that a large republic would be less likely to produce tyranny because no single group would be in charge. The idea of many center of power, i.e. checking each other, checking one another, and preventing any single authority from emerging also helped shape the internal structure of the federal government. The Constitution's most distinctive feature was its separation of powers within the government. It created a checks and balances among the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary branches. It also created the 2 houses, and the president would have the power to veto acts of Congress as well. So the Constitution of 1787 was a document that established a democratic republic for white people, and mostly white men, and does not distinctly discuss the Native Americans, slaves, women. If you were a white Anglo-Saxon male, this Constitution was for you, but if you were not, then sadly you were kind of stuck until it is revived later on. So now what we're going to look on is really going to talk about these 2 political parties, which are going to be the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. So who are the Federalists and who are the Anti-Federalists? Federalists were those supporters of the Constitution. That's what they called themselves. And those would be George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Those that saw themselves as Anti-Federalist, or later known as Republicans, would be Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, and they believed that the Constitution would increase taxes, they would weaken the states, wielded powers that were more suited to being a dictator. They favored the well-born over the common people, and they abolished and that it would abolish individual liberty. And that's how they viewed the Constitution. But their biggest complaint was the Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights, so therefore the people's rights were not protected. And so between the winters of 1787 and 1788, states began to ratify the Constitution, beginning with Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, and New Hampshire. And so what they really need to do now is kind of restructure the different, not restructure, but continue to give structure to these 3 branches. And next, what they're going to do is look at the executive branch, meaning the presidency. And so the first presidential election is going to be in 1789. Now, the first president of the United States is going to be George Washington. No one actually went against him. It was just unanimously given that he would be the first president. And so on September 25th, 1789, Congress is going to approve 12 amendments, and the first 10 amendments would serve as the Bill of Rights, including the freedom of religion, speech, and the press. Immunity from arbitrary arrest, trial by jury, and so on. And so Congress was left with the power to determine the number of Supreme Court judges to be appointed and the kinds of lower courts to be organized. And this is going to be seen within the Judiciary Act of 1789, where Congress approves for a Supreme Court to have 6 members in a system of lower district courts and a court of appeals. It's also going to give the Supreme Court the power to make the final decision in cases involving the constitutionality of state laws. So lots of creation happening within this time period to see what kind of government do we want. What do we like about the British government, and how do we mold that to the United States? That was really their focus. Is they liked certain aspects of the British government, and they kind of took that, molded it, made it their own. Now, we really need to look at the Federalists and the Republicans. Remember, the Republicans were prior known as the Anti-Federalists. So for 12 years, the Federalists had control of the new government, in part because George Washington envisioned a strong national government. However, the figure that emerged was not the president, who wanted to stay out of the focus, but Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton believed that a stable and effective government required an elite ruling class, and Hamilton wanted to create a permanent national debt with new bonds being issued as old ones were being paid off. He believed that the wealthy classes who are most likely to lend the government money would always want the government to survive. And so Hamilton wanted to create a national bank. This would provide loans and currency to businesses, give the government a safe place for the deposit of federal funds, and provide a stable center to the nation's small banking system. Now, Hamilton believed, or recommended, I should say, 2 types of taxes to complement the receipts anticipated from the sales of public lands to raise revenue. He wanted an excise tax on alcoholic beverages. He wanted a tariff on imports, a way to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. And Hamilton envisioned a nation with a wealthy, enlightened ruling class, a vigorous, independent commercial economy, and a thriving manufacturing sector. Now, few members of Congress opposed Hamilton's plan for funding the national debt. However, many did oppose his proposal to exchange new bonds for old certificates of indebtedness on a dollar-for-dollar basis. James Madison, a representative of Virginia, argued for a plan by which the new bonds would be divided between the original purchasers and the speculators. But Hamilton's allies insisted that the honor of the government required a literal fulfillment of earlier promises to pay whoever held those bonds. And so Congress passed the funding bill Hamilton wanted. However, his proposal that the federal government assume the state's debts encountered greater difficulty. Now, its opponents argued that the federal government took over the state debts. The states with the small debts would have to pay taxes to serve the states with the large ones. And so the Bank of the United States began to operate in 1791. And here is all the information again within this slide in case you would like it for your notes as well. Now this is a big topic, the national bank within American history, especially early American history. And there's going to be opposition, Republican opposition at this time as well. And those leaders are going to be Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And they believed that the Federalists were being a corrupt, tyrannical party. So there's already division being instilled. And we have barely been a nation for 10 years, if that. It's very, very interesting. So maintaining neutrality with the British is going to be difficult. So remember that the British were seizing hundreds of American ships in the French West Indies. And to avoid a war with Great Britain, Washington is going to send John Jay, which is the individual here, to calm down the situation. The goals were to secure compensation for the recent British assaults on American shipping, to demand withdrawal of British forces from their posts on the U.S. frontier, and to negotiate a commercial treaty with Great Britain. And so John Jay is sent over there in 1794 to create this Jay's Treaty, and it's going to utterly and completely fail to achieve these goals. However, it is going to pave the way for settlement of important American disputes with Spain later on, which falls into Pinckney's Treaty. So did it succeed? Absolutely not, but it had a really good outcome. So what is Pinckney's Treaty? Pinckney's Treaty is going to be the following year in 1795. So Spain is going to recognize the right of Americans to navigate the Mississippi to its mouth and to deposit goods at New Orleans for reloading ocean-going trips. It's going to agree to fix the northern boundary of Florida along the 31st parallel, and is going to command its authorities to prevent the Native Americans in Florida from launching raids north across the border. It's extremely significant, this treaty. And like I said, Jay's Treaty was very much a failure, but it led into Pinckney's Treaty, which was a huge success. So I wanted to show you this map to really show you how long the Mississippi River is. I really love maps, and I really love pictures, maps, paintings, primary sources, anything that gives you more of a visual representation of what we are discussing. So when I talk about the Mississippi River, this is it. And this is how important that this waterway is, especially to our early American history. So let's continue on. We're really going to start to talk about the downfall of the Federalists. So in the election of 1796, it's Adams versus Jefferson. Adams is going to win only by 3 electoral votes, and Adams becomes president and Jefferson becomes vice president. Now this is extremely common for the majority of our early American history, is that whoever wins the election. So let me back up a few moments. Early in our American history, when you look at who won the presidency, whoever won the election would become president. Whoever lost the election would become their vice president. We did not have ballots where a certain person was going for president and his vice president, who was on the same ticket in the same party, was our vice president. Always the person who lost was from a different party. Therefore, you had to work on the betterment for the country because you had to compromise, having the president be from one political party and the vice president being from another political party. Didn't know if you knew that, so now you do know. So let's continue on and let's talk about these acts, these Alien and Sedition Acts, because these are extremely significant. So the Alien Act is going to start to place new obstacles in the ways of foreigners for obtaining citizenship. Well, on the other side, these sedition acts allowed the government to prosecute those who engaged in, quote, sedition against the U.S. government. But it did not list what those sedition acts were. So that is seen as any harmful acts against the United States government, those that are libelous, those that are treasonous acts. However, the Republicans say that this was a campaign to attack them. And so 4 years later, when we have the quote revolution or the election of 1800, this is going to be Adams, who is a Federalist, versus Jefferson, who was a Republican. Now they were civil, but their supporters certainly were not. Federalists accused Jefferson of being a dangerous radical, whose supporters were wild men who would bring terror, as great as that as the French Revolution, if they came to power. And the Republicans accused Adams as being a tyrant, trying to be a king, and they accused the Federalists of plotting to impose slavery on the people. Now, the crucial state is going to be New York. That is the crucial area. There, Aaron Burr is going to monopolize the Tammany Society, a society of war veterans who were Republican. And apparently, Jefferson had won. However, the Constitution called for each selector to vote for 2 people, thinking a person would cast 1 vote for a presidential candidate and 1 vote for a vice president. However, when the votes were counted, Jefferson and Burr each had 73 votes. The House of Representatives had to choose between the candidates. However, the new Congress, with the majority being Republican, wasn't supposed to meet till after the inauguration of the new president. So the Federalist Congress had to decide, and they chose Jefferson. Very interesting. So this really concludes this lecture and discussion looking at the creation of the new republic, looking at the different constitutions, how we mold it and rewrote it, and tried to incorporate different aspects of it. And like we've discussed, there's lots of issues with the first documents that our country created. It does not equally represent those within our country, particularly with the Native Americans, with women, with slaves, people of color in general are not being represented. The people that are being represented are Anglo-Saxon white men, no matter what class. They now have a vote, which is great because they didn't prior to that, but there's much more room for improvement that we will be doing within the coming lectures. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind of where we were at the beginning of this lecture and now where we are at the end. And so we'll continue to add to this narrative within the coming PowerPoints.